Hello, everyone. We are going to start this press brief. So we are very glad and honored to have you all here today for this brief. So I'm Sophie Busson. I will be facilitating this discussion today. I work for Crisis Action, an international organization that works on the protection of civilians from armed conflict. We do not seek publicity, so please, I'm just here to facilitate the discussion, so please do not quote me or Crisis Action. Thank you. So today we will be listening to a panel of several representatives of major international humanitarian and human rights organizations who are active in the Gaza Strip. They will brief us on the reality of the humanitarian situation on the ground, addressing widespread misinformation around humanitarian pauses, truces, safe zones, humanitarian corridors, and call for an immediate and sustained ceasefire. We believe this discussion is even more crucial today, as there are reports of a deal happening between Israel and Hamas on possibly multiple-day pause and release of civilians held hostage in Gaza in exchange for the release of Palestinian prisoners. After this short briefing by NGO's representative, we will open the floor for your questions to the panelists. You will have the possibility to write a question in the Q&A box that you can see on your screen near the chat box. And you will also have the possibility to raise virtually your hand to directly ask a question. And we will also record this discussion that we can share afterwards, as well as press contacts for follow-up interviews of the speakers. And now we will start the discussion with our first panelist, Jason Lee, who is working for Save the Children as their country director in the occupied Palestinian territory. Thank you. Please, Jason.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start off by saying that the scale and scope of what we're seeing in Gaza and the humanitarian catastrophe is essentially underlined for the failure and lack of adherence to international humanitarian law and the premises of the centrality of protection for civilians. And as always, children pay the ultimate price. We have a situation where there is now over 14,000 civilians that have been killed, and at least 5,800 of them children. We now have a situation where one child is killed every 10 minutes. The numbers of civilians that have been injured have been increasing as well. Over 30,000 civilians are injured, and again, indicating the asymmetricness of this conflict. Almost 70%, that's 7 out of 10 of the civilian injuries is a woman or a child. We have a child being injured every 5 minutes. Now, civilians, especially children, are paying the highest price of this, and we see that there is really no safe space in Gaza. The civilian injuries and deaths have been occurring both in the north and the south of the Gaza Strip, and there's a situation where the 2.2 million people living in Gaza, half of them being children, are all impacted. 1.7 million of them are displaced. So they've left their homes and they're seeking refuge wherever they can find shelters in both the north and the south, in schools, government buildings, hospitals. The UN shelters estimate in the south there's about 930,000 civilians in the south, sheltering in UN premises. Now, these premises were not designed for this number of people. Each UN shelter, on average, is 4 times the maximum capacity. You can imagine the strain that this is placing, particularly on the delivery of life-saving assistance, such as food, water, access to critical water and sanitation facilities, and of course, the significant overcrowding means that the protection risks for children and the risk of spread of communicable diseases is increasing. And we see this already. Diarrheal diseases, skin diseases are all increasing within the shelters. There's still hundreds of thousands, an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 civilians that are still in the north. And for whatever reason, because they're unable to do so, these are vulnerable families, people of all abilities, the elderly, the sick, are not able to move and are still in the north, and they still require assistance. Now, a lot of families are resorting to coping mechanisms of eating 1 meal a day. The amount of water that is available to civilians for life-sustaining has decreased well beyond the global standards. On average, we're talking about 2 to 3 liters per person per day to stay alive. My colleagues will talk more about the impact on the health or the ability of civilians to access healthcare. But it is critical that children in particular are paying this price. Children, their bodies are more susceptible to the impacts of the explosive weapons that are currently being used. And we see the injuries that they are sustaining, the lack of access to healthcare. Again, 3 out of 4 healthcare facilities are no longer operational. There is not enough supplies, there is no electricity, and there's no ability for civilians to safely access healthcare. Sorry, we now have a new acronym as well for children that are unaccompanied. Parents are starting to write the names on the limbs of children for easy identification. We're at a situation where increasing numbers of civilians, again, we estimate there's about 4,500 children that are missing, presumed buried under the rubble, or unfortunately dead. The situation is getting worse day by day, and whilst the humanitarian pause is a welcome step in the right direction, it cannot replace a ceasefire. First and foremost, there is no safe space in Gaza. Civilians in the north and the south cannot reach safety or cannot be safe. There is insufficient goods coming into Gaza that will allow us to mount an effective response. All of our operations, from the UN to civil society, have been impacted. Our own teams are displaced and are seeking refuge in the shelters that they themselves are doing assessments in, and where possible, doing distributions in. It is critical that humanitarians be allowed to enter Gaza, that we have the full resumption of goods coming in, and there must be a ceasefire. From an operational perspective and from a safety perspective, a humanitarian pause is insufficient. The lack of fuel is critical. Humanitarians require fuel to also move and to restore operations and to ensure that we meet the civilians in need. Again, I want to stress that it is not just the physical injuries that we're seeing, the deprivation of access to food, causing civilians to starve, access to water, the real risk of dehydration, the increased risk of communicable diseases that we see, and the lack of protection of civilians, especially children. It is also critical to point out that there are longer-term mental health outcomes that we see for children in particular. Even prior to this escalation, all of the research by Save the Children indicates the increasing levels of depression, anxiety, feelings of withdrawal, and most depressing of all, a loss of hope and a loss of trust. It is critical that children are safe, and they need to feel safe, which is why we need the ceasefire. We need the entry of goods and personnel to deliver life-saving assistance, but also to meet the mental health and psychosocial needs of children. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you for your presentation on this dire situation. And now I will give the floor to Joël Weiler, who is the Executive Director of Doctors of the World.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you. I'm here as representative of MDM International Network, Médecins du Monde. First of all, let me tell you that the situation on the ground is catastrophic as never. We are out of words to describe it. We still have staff inside. They are our eyes inside. They continue to work on some few facilities that are partially running. I say really partially running. And then our colleagues, what they see at the ground levels. They see people dying from bombing. One of our colleagues, an emergency doctor, died in Gaza City because he was not able to escape to the south. And even in the south, he's still bombing. He was not able to escape to the south because his parents, mother and father, were too old to move. It's one guy among a lot of civilians that are not able to move to the south. And I'm not convinced at all that the south is safe. They are also dying by lack of care. As I'm a representative of medical organization, let me know that hospitals are running out of drugs, out of fuel, out of materials. There is some surgery without anesthesia. Some women die from avoidable complication in childbirth. It's bombing, no fuel to run the health facilities. Let's talk about the patients. with cancer, with chronic diseases that are running out of time without access to their treatment. And worse, and our colleagues, medical colleagues, could say more about that, but epidemics will arrive. When you see the situation in the living conditions, when you see the situation of dead bodies that could not be buried properly, epidemics will arrive. I'm not a specialist in human rights, but I read a bit. And hospital, healthcare centers, ambulance, pharmacy, health staff are directly attacked. We say that they are protected under international humanitarian law and should never be targeted. We are not targeted. We are not a target, and we are targeted. I'm talking about medical staff, but it's true for all my colleagues in the NGO sectors. We should not be targeted. Medical teams in this condition are completely exhausted. They are medical teams, but they are also Gaza people living in Gaza. They do try to survive all the population. We are talking about 1.5 million of people in south of Gaza now. They need support and respite. It's why we call for this press conference. We need ceasefires. We don't need to joke with a pause. We need real ceasefire. Pause are not happening. We do not see any stop in bombing. Several staff members told us that they tried multiple times to go to south, but had to turn around because of bombing. Pause are not realistic. You can't do anything in 4 hours. You can't do anything in 5 hours. Distribution is in 4 hours. It's just a dream. It's not real. You can't come from Egypt to Gaza and be able to do good distribution in 4 hours, in 10 hours, and even in 5 days. For medical organization, we can do a follow-up treatment for injured people in 4 hours with hospitals that are not running. So please, we need time and unrestricted, sorry for my English, we need time and unrestricted humanitarian access. No blackmail on humanitarian aids, no blackmail on human life. Many people, many organizations, the UN, the state, they are sending a lot of support for Gaza, but this support, this aid is not in Gaza. Without ceasefire, it's not useful at all. It doesn't matter if we cannot enter in Gaza that billions of millions of tons of fuel, of drugs are at the border and they could not enter. We really need a ceasefire. As you see, I think we are tired of technical discussion. I mean, now we need to be operational on field. We should have unrestricted access. We call the US government, the UK government, the EU, France, the international community to put pressure on Israel and Hamas to respect international humanitarian law and agree on an immediate and sustainable ceasefire. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. And to complete maybe your picture on the medical side, I'm going to give the floor to Avril Benoit, who is the Executive Director of Doctors Without Borders USA.
Thanks very much. Yes, and I definitely have a few more things to say about this whole question of the ceasefire that we need to save lives. So Doctors Without Borders, which is known internationally as Médecins Sans Frontières, and the acronym MSF, we have seen repeatedly since this began, hospitals being targeted, patients being targeted, health workers being targeted, ambulances, clinics, and we're worried about the safety of our staff and our patients. We have more than 300 staff who are Palestinian, who are trapped there under the siege. And we have an international team that is also now trying to reinforce doing surgeries in a hospital. And the conditions are impossible to be able to do proper coordinated humanitarian aid, which is something that people have a right to receive in a conflict. The catastrophic situation that many of you are aware of, I can drill down a little bit. Our staff members in Gaza are completely overwhelmed by the scale of human suffering. We are witnessing fighting in Gaza City that is nonstop. Thousands of people cannot leave there without risking their lives. We're extremely worried about our own colleagues. and all the civilians in Gaza. There's no safe space. For close to 2 months now, we've seen people without the basic necessities of life: water, food, medicine, the basics, electricity, the fuel that we need to be able to make things function. And what's happening to the hospitals specifically, as medical humanitarians, we reassert that hospitals should never, under any circumstances, be a target. They are treating people. People have gone there to find a space of peace, a space where there's some protection, humanitarian buildings, ambulances, these are spaces that should be respected for what they are. And it's dangerous and terrifying to think what is happening to the norms, to the laws of war. It's like this dystopian reality now where all the normal scaffolding of what is the conduct of responsible parties in a conflict are being completely perverted, and the supporters of some of these belligerents are standing by, watching it happen. And what we're watching happen, of course, may well be war crimes. They should be investigated. There should be international observers on the ground. There should be much more probing of the misinformation, disinformation that is out there flying around, while we humanitarians are just trying to save lives. On November 21st, 2 of our doctors, as you may have heard, Dr. Mahmoud Abu Nujaila and Dr. Ahmad Al-Sahar, killed in a strike in Al-Auda hospital. And they're not the only humanitarians who have been killed, of course. This follows multiple extremely troubling events for all of us, our teams, their families. We had an attack on an MSF convoy that every party knew about, that they were having to leave Al-Shifa hospital area and reach the south, and they were caught in an attack, and it was deadly. And this is totally unacceptable. Hospitals, again, should never be a target. And we're not lawyers, we're doctors, we're nurses, we're midwives, just trying to alleviate the suffering and treat people. And what we see is these arguments, these fake justifications for why it's okay to target civilians in a hospital. And it's not. And no one should stand aside and watch this perversion of the norms of international law. The World Health Organization has been documenting 178 attacks as of yesterday, attacks on healthcare infrastructures in the Gaza Strip, resulting in 553 fatalities, 696 casualties, including 22 fatalities, 48 injuries of healthcare workers who were on duty, who were actually treating people. And so just to wrap up, and I do welcome your questions, but as we're now in the realm of the humanitarian pause, right? This temporary pause, it'll be called a ceasefire. It's not really a ceasefire from what we're seeing. The widespread and indiscriminate bombing campaign in Gaza, the collective punishment that is going on in Gaza must stop immediately. All parties to the conflict must ensure the safety of civilians. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I will give now the floor to Daniel Azizi, who is the country manager for Palestine for the organization Handicap International in Humanity and Inclusion.
Yes, thank you, Sophie. Well, I think my colleagues actually have illustrated the situation in Gaza quite well, especially from the health perspective. Me, I would like just to add up a little bit on that, on the causes and actually what the relentless bombing is causing also on civilians in Gaza. It's leaving such a trail of devastation and affecting civilian population directly, but also indirectly. I mean, the relentless bombing is not just killing civilians, but is also causing a wide range of devastating injuries, from broken bones to severe burning to flesh wounds that are very difficult to treat. And all of that is resulting from direct shelling, but also from the blast that is caused by the shelling. So there is a direct effect when you're caught, and an indirect effect on all that is the surrounding. And this especially with high range of bombs that are currently being used in Gaza. In addition, the explosion force and of course the blast and the wave of air pushes people against objects that are usually concrete, and that is causing severe spinal injuries, including amputation. And I would like also to spend a word on amputation. I think we all have heard and read the cry out of doctors from Gaza that are saying that amputation are happening without anesthesia, simply because there is none left in Gaza. And amputation actually leave patients in devastating pain. And the state of the health system in Gaza, the damaged hospitals, the destroyed hospital, the medical facilities, and all that is still standing and left to cure these people is not enough. And cases that would be normally treated to alleviate the pain and actually maintain a functionality in the body as just now treated to save lives, which means that there is no aftermath care, there is no rehabilitation, and this leads to potentially permanent disability. Before the current hostilities, we were looking at 21% of persons with disabilities in Gaza. Some of them, a good portion of them, already resulted for previous escalation. Now we have zero visibility. We cannot even attempt to estimate on how many persons with disability we will be looking at after the end of these current hostilities. We have no means to prevent disabilities in the current condition. We have no means to assess and to care for the injured people and pre-existing disabilities. We cannot guarantee to them appropriate care and appropriate follow-up. And actually, we will not, even in the event of a humanitarian pause, the 4 hours humanitarian pause that seems now to be abandoned, and now the emerging discussion and the agreed humanitarian pause for a longer period of 4 or 5 days, or temporary ceasefires that we want to call that, is nowhere nearly enough to reach the population in need. Absolutely not. Healthcare is a continuous need. Access to food, water is a continuous need. Protection is a continuous need. Make sure that the dignity of people is maintained is a continuous need. And all of that cannot be performed in 4 hours or 4 days for what matters, or 5 days or 7 days, or whatever time is being given for the ceasefire of the temporary ceasefire. Sorry for that. Humanitarian aid workers cannot deliver aid to 2 million people in 4 hours or 4 days. We cannot deliver food to 2 million people, care to 2 million people, and we cannot access multiple areas. We are prevented to access the north. We do not know what will happen with the temporary ceasefire. We are not safe to move, and we do need a ceasefire. We do need safe passage to assess the people in need, and we need no less than that. We do need a ceasefire, and we do need it now. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela, for this very clear picture and recommendations. And I will give now the floor to our last panelist, Paul O'Brien, who is the Executive Director of Amnesty International USA. Please, Paul.
Thank you. It is so important that yesterday a commitment was made to release some of the Israeli hostages and release Palestinian detainees, as we understand it, and that there may be a several-day pause in the fighting. Hostage taking by Hamas was a war crime, and their safe and unconditional return is a step forward. And any time in which there's not shelling or shooting that is killing civilians is a step forward. But as others have said so eloquently on this call, on a humanitarian basis, it's not enough. And it's certainly not enough in human rights terms. The way that Israel has prosecuted this war, with the support of the Biden administration, forcibly displacing more than 1 million people, denying them food, water, fuel, using collective punishment, indiscriminate bombings, and the use of weapons like white phosphorus that hurt civilians. All of this needs time to be investigated as war crimes. The IDF and the United States argue that because Hamas is the target and they live in Gaza, the IDF is adhering to humanitarian law when they bomb churches, schools, hospitals. They are wrong, and these acts must be investigated as war crimes. Because the IDF suspects that there might be Hamas infrastructure under a hospital or a refugee camp, they believe they can shut down those spaces and kill or forcibly displace thousands of civilians in order to find out. They are wrong, and that needs to be investigated as a violation of humanitarian war. Until we have those investigations, we've every reason to fear that what happened in Al-Shifa will happen in every other hospital. What happened in Jalabia will happen in every other refugee camp and densely populated area. So any pause that does not also stop international humanitarian legal violations is not going to restore human rights conditions on the ground. When this short pause is over, where will we be if the war resumes on the same terms? Winter is coming. Much of the infrastructure for self-care has been decimated. Shelters have been destroyed, and people who cannot return there hear Israel's leaders say they will never be able to return to their homes. Thousands more children and parents will be killed and wounded. Many more will be attacked on the roads they are being told to travel to seek safety. Gaza was once an open-air prison. Today, it is worse than that. After a 16-year blockade, living in occupied territory, which violates the international law of apartheid, meeting urgent needs in Gaza is not going to happen in a pause for a few days, and is not going to happen with a few hundred aid trucks, as essential and crucial as they are. If we were living in Gaza now, what would we want in human rights terms right now? Yes, we would want the bombings to stop permanently. Yes, we would want urgent health care for our physical and mental wounds, safety for our children, enough food and water to get through the next few weeks and months, time and safety to pull bodies from the rubble, bury them with dignity, and prevent the epidemic that will no doubt come if these things don't happen. The only way to meet all these needs is a permanent cessation of humanitarian law violations and a ceasefire long enough to restore human rights to millions of people. That's why we're joining this call for an immediate and sustained ceasefire. Those with influence over Israel, particularly President Biden and this Congress, need to stand for human rights and work for that sustained ceasefire and suspend arms transfers and support for any measures that violate international humanitarian law. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for your presentation, and thank you to all the panelists for your feedback on this dire situation on the ground. Now that you heard many of the representatives of this humanitarian and human rights organization and this common agreement on the need and the urgency to get a sustainable and immediate ceasefire and not just a pause for a few hours, a few days, I will open the floor for questions to the panelists. Just to let you know that on top of the speaker you just heard, we have the chance to have with us today also Sama Hadid from the Norwegian Refugee Council. We have Chiara Saccardi from Action Against Hunger, and we have Bushra Khalidi from Oxfam, who are also available to answer your questions. And so please, you can put your questions in the Q&A box, but also raise your hand. And please, if you could just say your name and the name of your media. That would be really great. And we will, again, just to remind you, record a discussion that we can share afterwards, as well as press contacts for follow-up interviews of the speaker. So I will start. So we received many questions. The first question is coming from ABC News, asking, what is the longer-term plan? With winter coming, what do you plan to do to help the displaced if you get access? Along with the second question, what is the situation at the Indonesian hospital? Are you worried it will be the next Al-Shifa? So on the first question, regarding the longer-term plan and the winter coming, we would like to come up.
I can try taking that. Look, I think critically right now, our focus is very much on life-saving. So this is to make sure that people do have access to food, water, and absolutely the winter has come. The situation now, the last couple of days has been raining in Gaza with high winds. So we're looking at bringing in sufficient non-food items like tents, bedding, warm clothing, etc., which is critical especially to keep young children warm. Excuse me. And of course, there is the sorry, sorry about that. I think it's quite critical to look at again the current shelters cannot.
If you want, Jason, we can come back to you in 2 minutes.
Thank you.
If you want. So we have a second question about the situation in the Indonesian hospital. It's the same question from ABC News. Who would like to take this question? Does any of the speaker have some intel on that situation?
Can I?
Yes.
Yes. Actually, Bouchard, why don't you go first?
Bouchard.
And I'll add a few
I think
comments.
probably MSF have some better intel on the details of the hospital, but I think what the question here is about is whether there is Hamas operations under Indonesian hospital. So it would have been good if that could be clarified. But we know that Indonesian hospital has been struggling as much, if not more, than Al Shifa. It still remains a place where people are sheltering. Though many have tried to evacuate, we know that it was struck today by shelling, specifically the surgery unit of the Indonesian hospital. But again, I think that the question is broader than whether there are operatives in hospital, and really it's about the distinction and principle of proportionality in international law. And we must remind all parties involved of the principle of proportionality in international law, and ask the question whether is it proportionate to bomb a hospital, to besiege a hospital, to prevent fuel and water and food from patients and from people sheltering in a hospital. Is that a proportionate response? I am not the International Criminal Court of Justice, and I cannot make that legal determination, but I think that a reasonable person probably can think that we cannot agree that 14,000 people killed are collateral damage, and they should not be collateral damage. And I stress the obligations and the duties of all parties under international law when it comes to the principle of proportionality and how it's applied, and use of excessive use of force, and how it has been applied so far in the last 6 weeks in Gaza. And Avriel, please.
Yeah, to be clear, we're not an intel gathering organization. We're a medical humanitarian organization. And any suggestion that doctors or nurses who are working within a hospital are aware of these allegations of command centers, of course, you hear them on the news. That's part of the main talking points to justify what may be war crimes. But to our knowledge, we have not seen such things. And so suddenly the burden of proof gets flipped on the people who are inside the hospital trying to work and save patients. And all these kinds of allegations, of course, are deeply concerning, right? It would be wrong for a hospital to be used as a command center or as a stockpile of weapons or as a launching pad. That would be putting the hospital under direct threat for all the patients and the medical staff and the thousands of civilians that are sheltering in these hospitals. So it would be extremely alarming were it to be true, but the burden of proof rather, is upon those making these unsubstantiated allegations. And that's why it only makes sense to have independent investigators, observers, actually looking into all these allegations to sort this out, because otherwise, what we're looking at are violations of international humanitarian law. We're looking at targeted attacks on a civilian infrastructure that is being used to treat and shelter people.
Thank you, Avriel. And I think Paul would like to come from Amnesty International.
Yeah, just to say, we found no credible evidence to support the claims that Al-Shifa was housing a military command center. Even if there had been a legitimate military objective in the vicinity of the buildings that were hit, the strikes failed to distinguish between military objectives and civilian objects. And so there are still concerns around international humanitarian law, even if they had found that infrastructure, and we've not seen any evidence from any institution, including the IDF, that sufficiently proves this was a military command center.
Thank you, Paul. We also have a couple of questions regarding the humanitarian access. I have this question from Happy. What are the mechanisms of getting more aid to Gazans? You want to get aid to northern Gaza, of course. How will you plan to do that, given the restriction? Have you heard anything about the restoration of access through Kerem Shalom crossing? And there is this question from Washington Post. I would be grateful for the panel's thought on what realistically can be achieved by humanitarian organization during a 4-day pause. What aid can enter and what can it reach? How much can be restocked and how many people will those items reach? On humanitarian access, who would like to respond to those questions? Yes, Chiara.
I may try to take this one. On humanitarian access, we need to consider that the access that is now available through Rafah is limited. There is a logistic limitation into what can enter through the crossing. And one of the key important points is that we enable, or we find a way to enable more crossing points. So that is a very key point. So you ask about how much we can do in 4-day pause. Well, if you consider that in some of the shelters you have 20,000 people sheltering, and they have available like one latrine for 650 persons, then you can only figure what is the need on the ground right now. So whatever can enter right now through Rafah is not enough. It's not enough in terms of fuel. We know that the fuel is a very basic item that we need to get entering in a more consistent, more quantity way in order to have the water systems functioning, to have movements across the territory. So again, access is very much depending, first of all, on security. So again, we call for a sustained ceasefire in order to have security for our people to be able to move on the ground, and for the civilians to be able to reach the humanitarian aid that is being delivered. And then this difficulty of reaching the north, where we know that the needs are very, very dire, very high. How can we go there where there is no fuel to be able to move the people now, the humanitarian operators, or those that we are in the south right now? How can we reach the north without the fuel? So again, it's really a matter of, when we talk about access, enabling more crossing points in order to make these trucks, these items, these goods able to enter into Gaza, having enough quantity of fuel to make the trucks able to move across all the territory and reach the people that are more in need. This, I would say, that is a very, very key issue to understand that the 4 days are not going to be enough for what is needed and the difficulty that is present right now on the ground.
Thank you, Chiara. I believe, Joel, you want to add something on that question.
Yeah, Chiara was perfect, but just to add some point. I think there is no humanitarian access even if you open Rafah is not enough. Kerem Shalom, they should open other entry points. For medical organization, 4 days of pause, sorry, but it's Band-Aid, it's not healthcare. It's 4 days of Band-Aid. You can't follow the treatment. You can do nothing. I mean, it's this is not humanitarian access. It's a joke. 4 days is nothing. I mean, we need more. We need to have access to the population, and the population, Chiara was super clear, need to have access to us. I mean, I have surgical kits at the border that could not enter in Rafah. Even if it enter, it will be 4, 5, 6 days. I mean, to be able to deliver to the good doctor, to the good surgeon. And just imagine, to plan the surgery, people need time. I mean, it's sorry because my English is weak, but it's a joke. I have not other word. I mean, it's a joke. It's just humanitarian washing, you know. It looked like as a ceasefire, but test maybe as a ceasefire, but it is not a ceasefire, so it is not humanitarian access. Thank you.
Thanks, Joel. I see we have some hands that are raised. I will give the floor to Isabelle Debris.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I was wondering, so you mentioned all those key issues about, needing to kind of to open another crossing, needing more fuel. Have you received any assurances that these might happen, or are these just, seem absolutely ideals that are not in implementation at all?
I see the panelists nodding their hand, but yes, Samar, please, from Norwegian Refugee Council.
Unfortunately, there have been no assurances of Karam Shalom, Erez crossings, other crossings to be opened in the future. And they could be opened. These were functional before October 7th. They could be very easily mobilized and resourced to open up, which is what we need. We need an urgent scale up of aid. Rafah crossing is not enough. It wasn't even built to provide aid on the scale of needs that we're seeing in Gaza. So it's really a question of political will now. The barrier is around political will to open up other crossings. And unfortunately, we're not seeing this push from different governments around the world to really give it that momentum it needs to open up other crossings into Gaza. So it's really, really crucial at this point. And I think, again, it also goes hand in hand with the need to increase fuel amounts and for fuel to be distributed to a wide range of partners and to support civilian infrastructure in Gaza. So I think one goes hand in hand with the other, but it's really unfortunate that we're not seeing that push really from governments, from the EU, from the US to open up other crossings.
Thank you. Thank you. We are lots of questions coming up. I see the hand raised of Paul Derinzo. We're going to give you the floor. Can you also tell for which media you're working for, please? Thank you.
Hi, this is Paul from WBAI Radio in New York City, part of the Pacifica Radio Network. And my question was basically, are the aid workers seeing anything that would amount to a second Nabka, pushing people permanently out of Gaza, or are they just letting them stay in the south? Are they possibly, or do you see any signs of pushing people into Egypt, that this could go further than it has? And are you prepared in case that would happen? And that question's to everybody, whoever might know something about that. Thank you.
Who would like to answer this question? Yes, Paul from Amnesty International.
Well, just to say, facts on the ground are 50% of buildings in the north at least uninhabitable. No signs of a serious intent on the part of the Israeli military to restore people to shelter with winter coming. Senior officials in the Israeli government on record saying, or I'm not sure if it's on record, but quoted as saying they have no plans to return populations, and worse than that. We are deeply concerned that the impacts of the forced displacement that's already happening is not actually temporary. And we have no confidence that the steps are being taken either by the Israeli government, the levels of aid that are going in, or the access that's been given to humanitarian organizations, that we will be able to work over time to restore people to their homes. That's why we need something more than 4 or 5 days, because we can't even begin to talk seriously about restoring people to their homes with these kinds of pauses.
Thank you, Paul. And I believe, Samar, you wanted to respond to a question.
I mean, just to add from the start, we consider that the evacuation orders given by Israel amounted to a forcible transfer of the population, because they did not ensure guarantees of safety of return of adequate humanitarian assistance to the population, which would amount to a war crime. So I think we need to be clear about these terms that are being used around humanitarian corridors, around pauses, and be clear on the fact that this is a forcible relocation of the population that has taken place. There is growing concern now that the statements made by senior Israeli officials point to an intent on mass deportations of the Palestinian civilian population. And we need to raise awareness around this. This would obviously be against international humanitarian law and a grave breach of international law. And these statements are being made without any question, without any accountability. So I think now is the time to raise the alarm around this risk. There is a real risk of mass deportations of the Palestinian population into Egypt and other countries. And obviously, people have a right of return. They should be returned to their homes in the north. And there needs to be, I think, just a stronger pushback on these statements that are being made.
Thank you, Samar, for this clarification. We have now a question from USA Today. Could you please expand on the mental health of children you're seeing and how this could affect them long term? Similarly, could you also describe what you're hearing from your colleagues about the mental health struggle of doctors and nurses on the ground right now?
Yep. Hi, thanks very much, everyone. Look, I can take this question. I think it's quite critical to note that children can recover, particularly, but in order for them to recover, they first and foremost must feel safe again. And this is why it's critical that we need the ceasefire. For children to stop having the trauma that they're experiencing from what they're seeing around them, what they're hearing around them, and what they're feeling, especially young children. They may not understand exactly what is going on, but they see, hear, and they feel the terror that's happening. So we need the ceasefire in order for children to first and foremost feel safe. It is also critical that more humanitarians are able to enter. The number of trained social workers, of psychiatrists, of clinical psychologists in Gaza is insufficient to meet the need, the overwhelming need for mental health and psychosocial support that children need right now. So personnel have to go in order to do whatever we can to first and foremost identify the children that need the most care. We've had unconfirmed reports that children are suffering so much that even when the food is present, they're not able to eat. So it is critical that there is the ceasefire, prolonged, sustained ceasefire to stop the triggers for children, personnel, medical personnel, trained social workers, psychologists going in, including any medication or treatments that will be required to actually address the needs of these children. Of course, all aid workers are also impacted. All of our staff, like the 1.7 million Gazans, have been displaced. They are seeking refuge in schools as well, so they need support. This can only happen if there is a ceasefire, if more supplies go in and more people go in so that we can rotate our teams, we can actually provide them the therapy and treatment that they need and support that they need so they can continue identifying, distributing to, and supporting the civilian population that do require assistance. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason. Joël, you want to complete? Yes.
Yes, thank you. Because I think it's super relevant on our topic of the ceasefire. First of all, I think mental health was an issue in Palestine and specifically in Gaza since years. It's not a new issue. And it's quite obvious, and Jason do the demonstration. I mean, people are forced to be displaced under bombing. You know, I see some question: no more school, no more minimum of basic needs. And this might be solved for 4 days humanitarian pause. I mean, mental health is a long-term treatment, long-term program. I mean, it's more than a need. It was a reality before. It's even worse now. I have a testimony of one of my colleagues or one of my staff. Even if we come out of this alive, we will never recover. I link that with the previous questions. What will happen in the north? I think people are convinced they will never go back in the north. I don't know what will happen. I'm not in the Israeli government, but people are aware about that. People are afraid about that. You have to move one more time. You have to lose everything. Just imagine the children in this condition. I mean, Paul said during the panelist speech, Gazawi people were living in an open jail, open prison before. They have reduced the prison by 3. I mean, just imagine the impact on the population, on the children. I mean, and it's why it doesn't make sense to give us 4 hours a day, even 4 days, even 4 weeks is not enough for minimum basic humanitarian assistance.
Thanks, Joel. Please, Ariel.
I can add that for those medical workers who decided when ordered to move from the north to the south, but they decided to stay at the bedside of patients, to continue volunteering in hospitals, to continue trying to use their skills for the best of what they could possibly offer. I mean, this is a radical act of solidarity, and it is grinding, because not only are they dehydrated, undernourished, with children of their own that they worry they will never see again when they come home from work at night. All these weeks and weeks of moral distress as physicians performing surgery without anesthesia, knowing that somebody's going to die of sepsis, knowing that 50% of the patients that are coming in with burn injuries to a hospital are not going to be saved. Not because they couldn't be saved under the normal circumstances of a very long-term management of infection, really careful. I mean, it could have been possible, but they will not. They will die because of the siege, of the shortage of medication that has, in addition to the lack of fuel to run the electricity for all the medical equipment, is killing people. All the women giving birth at home or in rubble with meager little birthing kits on their own, in a place where you have so many thousands of people. I mean, right now, even there's questions of, well, why don't you just set up some field hospitals, as if that will replace the actual hospital infrastructure that every day is being destroyed hospital by hospital. We're looking at 20,000 people who are injured, and these doctors, these nurses are suffering a mental health burden like you can't believe. And it will last. It's going to exhaust many, and yet through the sheer force of will and courage, they are continuing to show up for their patients, and we should be applauding them, not targeting them.
Thank you, Avery, for this important reminder. We will take 2 other questions. The first one from Anna Maria Holmgren, and then we will take the question of Laura Kelly. Please, Anna Maria.
I don't know if you can hear me. Hello?
Yes, you can.
Hi, I'm Anna Maria Holmgren from the Swedish Radio Airports. Actually, I kind of had the same question as Lovisa Lovelock. Like, what aid can enter, and where can it reach during this 4-day truce?
Thanks, Anna Maria. Who would like to answer?
But I can.
Well,
I can
I'll just quickly answer that if there's not a lot of fuel coming in, it won't be able to be distributed and reach the people who need it most. So, I mean, right there, there's a problem.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, on top of that, I mean, whatever the size of aid that we will be able to get in, it's kind of a drop in the ocean if we don't have fuel and we don't have access, because it will actually reach a very minimal portion of the population in need. This is the first place. We have hundreds of thousands of people actually that decided to stay in the north, but that could not move for several reasons, including, for instance, for persons with disability. My team received dozens of calls asking for help, because of course a wheelchair cannot go on destroyed roads, cannot walk on for kilometers without having a rest or without having a support, and sometimes they are also unaccompanied. So it's I think that we should not ask ourselves how much aid we can get in 4 days, is how much we should be getting in, and how then we use that aid, and how much more do we need to actually be having any impact on the current situation. Yeah, then I see Jason maybe to complement on that.
Yeah, thanks, Danila. And I think it goes to the questions that what are we doing now? Again, we are delivering, but under very difficult and extreme conditions that we don't see anywhere else. We don't have access to the infrastructure, the humanitarian architecture that we normally would in mounting a response. Our teams are all sheltering, and they are doing assessments in the schools that they are sheltering in. The meager aid that we're getting in from trucks, we're trying to distribute as much as possible, knowing that there's no fuel. So again, we're very restricted in who we can reach. We can't do the normal assessments that we would do to identify the most vulnerable. We are still working, and even if there is a 4-day pause, without more goods coming in, without more people coming in, without fuel, we are still restricted in what we can do. This is why the ceasefire is the only solution that will enable us to really expand operations, and not just the ceasefire, but the full resumption of goods, people, and fuel coming into Gaza. Otherwise, we are just band-aids, and very ineffective band-aids, particularly when there's still ongoing shelling, ongoing airstrikes. The injuries that civilians have sustained are not healing themselves, and they're getting worse. The lack of food and the dehydration that children and people are suffering from will not resolve themselves. So again, a 4-hour pause is insufficient. It really does nothing much. We need the ceasefire, we need the access, we need the goods and the people coming in, and we need the safety. This is the only way that we can save lives and we can plan for the next stage. And again, it's the whole question of what happens next, is that this is all hinged upon a successful ceasefire, the restoration of our operations and our ability to do our jobs.
Thank you, Jason. Chiara, I believe you want to add something, and then we will give the floor to Laura Kelly.
Yeah, just to add to what has been mentioned so far, also to put a light on how difficult it is also to consider repairs. So when we talk about the lack of water, for example, which is one of the main or among the very, very important limitations that we witness right now in Gaza, without the infrastructure being able to work. But what does it take to repair those infrastructures that have been damaged by the bombing? It means also that materials should be entering. So it's not only a matter of how much material enters, it's also a matter of which type of material is allowed to be entered in order to make the basic infrastructure functions at least at a minimum level, but we are not there. So those are not functioning. And again, remember that there is a logistical limitation on what can enter through Rafah crossing. As long as it's only Rafah crossing, they do not open Keren Shalom, they do not open Erez and so on. The quantity of items that can enter are anyway limited.
Thank you, Chiara. We're going to take now the question of Laura Kelly, please.
Hi, thanks so much. Just following up on something that Paul said, calling for the US and President Biden to exercise influence on Israel to a ceasefire. And I think Joel also said that the US, UK, France should pressure Israel and Hamas to a ceasefire. So if you could just speak to which countries you think can exercise the most influence over Hamas to accept a ceasefire. Thank you.
Happy to take that. So as the UN General Assembly vote indicates, most countries now want a ceasefire. So do most UN agencies and the leadership of the United Nations. The US and other countries that have leverage and influence with Israel must step in. We need G7 countries that have been on the fence about this to step in. Those who've been talking about, first we need a pause and then we need a ceasefire, need to make very clear that the call for a pause cannot stand in the way of a call for a permanent ceasefire. We are very concerned that some of these same countries are continuing to send arms, weapons into the context. That needs to stop. You can't both be legitimately calling for a ceasefire and continuing to send arms. The arms that are also going to Hamas and Palestinian armed groups also needs to stop. We need every country that has leverage with both Israel and Hamas to use that leverage now if we are going to create the conditions on the ground to actually meet the needs that my colleagues have talked about.
Thanks, Paul. We have another question, which is what information do you have about the situation of people who are still in the north, and what is happening between Kuwait roundabout and Wadi Gaza corridor? This blackout, about this blackout for the population in Gaza.
Yeah, I can take that. Actually, I mean, this is a very good point. The information that are coming out from the north are minimal, inconsistent, and impossible to verify. Because again, we are unable to access the north, so we cannot confirm how many people have stayed in the north, what is the condition of the people that have stayed in the north. We can assume that they have no food, we can assume that they have no water, as aid does not reach the north. We know that hospitals have been severely damaged to the point of being destroyed and requested to evacuate, so it means that there is no health services. But you see, again, this is an estimation. We do not have exact numbers, so we cannot access need. And I would like also to recall here that this communication is also a basic need. I mean, we need to understand that communication is really life sometimes. I mean, it's about calling for help, calling medical services, inform even the basic point of informing your beloved ones that you are okay or that you are not okay. So this is a right that's been deprived throughout the Strip, and particularly there in the north, where news are so restricted and scattered across the time. So we cannot, at least this coming from HI, we cannot provide a full account on what is happening in the north. And the same goes for what is happening around the roundabout of Kuwait roundabout and the safe corridor. We know from the calls that we receive that persons with disabilities cannot access this corridor. For sure, whenever they choose to access it, it's impossible for them, as no car can cross. And even if car would allow to cross, there is again no fuel too. So this is also the only thing that we can actually confirm for the time being.
Thanks, Daniela. Maybe a last question, because I think we are running out of time. So I have this question from the Canadian press. The Canadian government says the new agreement is a first step toward a lasting peace, such as a ceasefire. Do you agree with this contention, or is it not appropriate given the ongoing violence?
Okay, but I think we answer many times about that. No, it's not enough. It's a band-aid, and it will solve nothing. Might be a first step of discussion, but it will change nothing in terms of operation and in terms of humanitarian aid. So, I mean, it's I think all the humanitarian community called for a ceasefire, a real ceasefire, not a 4-day pause. It will change not a lot on the field. We might be able to bring drugs, fuel, but we will not be able to manage it correctly and to reach people in needs.
Thank you, Joël, and thank you to all for attending this press brief. We will be able to share with you afterwards a background paper again regarding what is the situation on the ground regarding this issue of POSIS corridors, and we will be able also to send you the record of this discussion as well as press contact for follow-up interviews of the speaker. Thank you to all the panelists and thank you to all the journalists for being here today. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.